Print is usually one of the first built-in functions that new Python programmers learn about, but many Pythonistas don't realize how versatile the print function really is. Let's learn about some of the print function's superpowers. Python's f strings pair very nicely with the built-in print function. But keep in mind that the print function also accepts multiple arguments. So if we're using an f string just to put spaces between a couple variables, we could pass multiple arguments to print instead. By default, the print function will put a space between each argument we pass to it. So if you need to smush a few values together with spaces between them, you could use an f string, or you could pass multiple arguments to print. Sometimes one approach is more readable than the other, so try them both out. Python's print function doesn't just accept more than one argument, it accepts any number of positional arguments. So if we wanted to print every item in a list, we could use the star operator to call the print function while passing each item in a list as a separate argument. This doesn't just work on lists, it works on any iterable. For example, we could unpack a generator object into print to see each of its values. But why bother using the star operator when we could just use the string join method? For starters, it's a little bit shorter to write, but it's also more flexible. Let's say we'd like to print numbers with spaces between each one. If we use the join method, we'll get an error when joining those numbers together. To use the string join method on an iterable, all of the items need to be strings. We need to convert each item to a string by using either a list comprehension or a generator expression and passing that to the join method. But the print function can do this conversion automatically. The print function automatically converts whatever objects we give to it to strings. What if we'd like to join our values together by something that isn't a space character? For example, let's say we have a list of strings and we'd like to print each string with new line characters between them. We could use the join method for that. Or we could use the print function's optional sep argument. The sep argument defaults to a space character, which is why print puts spaces between each argument by default. But we can set the sep argument to any string we'd like. For example, we could make it a comma followed by a space character. Combining the star operator with the sep argument makes the print function a pretty great alternative to the string join method, as long as we're joining for the sole purpose of printing what we've joined. The print function is handy for displaying output at the terminal, but that's not its only use. In fact, print is really a helper function for writing to a file object. The default file that print prints to happens to be standard output. Standard output is an object that acts like a writable file. But when we write to the standard output file-like object, instead of writing to an actual file on disk, it writes to our terminal window. The print function writes to standard output by default, but we can print to a different file-like object by customizing the file argument. For example, here we're printing to standard error, which is the other output file stream in our terminal. And here we're printing to an actual file. Sometimes I prefer to print to files instead of manually calling the file write method. That way, I don't need to worry about converting objects to strings before writing and putting a new line character at the end of each write call. Speaking of new line characters, is there any way to use print without printing a new line at the end? What if we want to print something, but we don't want it to print all on its own? By default, the print function writes a new line at the end of everything we've called it with. But print accepts an optional end argument that we can use to customize this behavior. For example, here's a print call that prints 2 new line characters instead of just 1. And here, we're printing to a file without adding a new line at the end, and then we print again to put something else on the same line. If we look at this file afterward, we'll see that there's just one line within it. Note that if we pass an empty string to end at the Python REPL, we may end up with the next prompt starting at the end of the previous output line. The default in value of a new line character is particularly helpful within the Python REPL. Print is a utility function that makes it easier to write data to a file. It just so happens that the default file object that print writes to is standard output, which prints to the terminal screen instead of actually writing to a file on disk. The next time you need to join some data together to display it in your terminal or write it to a file, consider using the built-in print function.